This is an interview for the Industrial Relations Society of New South Wales Oral History Project. The interviewee is Vernon Winley, and I'm the interviewer, Judy Hughes. The date is the 30th of November, 2021. Welcome, Vern.
Thank you, Judy. Nice to see you again.
Can we start with your early influences in life, where you're from, and a bit about your family background?
Well, I was born in Gilgandra, which is about the geographical centre of New South Wales. My father was a school teacher, and both my grandfathers were farmers. So if that's makes something, I don't know. But I do have a theory that country kids, or kids brought up in the country, had an easier time working in industrial relations sometimes than people who had brought up in the city, and because it's bigger, there tend to be more of an echo chamber of the people in the same grouping or belief systems or in inverted commas class, even if you like to put it that way. Whereas kids from the country from the beginning knew everyone and spoke to everyone and had to relate to everyone. So they were a bit more used to be differences and different points of view. Now that's only a theory. I have not done any research or anything, but fun to think about.
And what about your academic background? What schools did you go to, and what was your first job?
Well, I finished high school, Kiama High School, leaving certificate, and I worked for a little while at the steelworks at Port Kembla because that was the local employer at Australian Iron and Steel, as it was. But I wanted to go to university, and I got a cadetship from CSR, so that meant moving to Sydney and working for the first year, and then going to university and working in the holidays. And I did a science degree because Sputnik had just gone up. I was going to be a great scientist and win a Nobel Prize for chemistry. Didn't quite work out that way, but that was where I was going when I was about 17.
And what was your job at CSR?
Well, as I started off, I was a laboratory chemist in doing the analytical work, but after I'd finished uni, and with a bit of training, I was sent off to Fiji to be a shift supervisor in a sugar mill. And I arrived with my sort of degree nice and newly minted in my back pocket, thinking I knew all about sugar chemistry, and it didn't take me very long to work out it was about 5% chemistry and about 95% managing people, getting people to do what they needed to do, and being able to make a team. And so when I came back from Fiji after 3 years or so there, I went back to uni and did economics and industrial relations, and CSR transferred me to their industrial relations department.
And did you seek that transfer, Vern?
No, not really. I knew I wanted to do something other than pure chemistry, but they were the days when your career was a bit mapped out for you by the company. You didn't apply for things. So the boss was away one day, but I had to open the mail to deal with anything urgent that came up, and I took this letter out and said, "Mr. Winley's transfer to the industrial department will take place on the 6th of June. So I blinked twice because I didn't know anything about industrial relations at that stage. I'd just done the economics and the political science. And I found out, and I went, and I found out I liked it. I really fell into the right place.
And what was your job in doing industrial relations? What tasks did you have?
Well, I was, for the first 6 months, I guess I shadowed one of the senior industrial officers, or a couple of them, and just learnt a little bit about what was going on. And Brian Brennan, who was the chief industrial manager and who was a great mentor of mine and of many other people, said to me one day, "Oh, there's a case on that we just want to know the outcome of. We're not directly involved, down in the New South Wales Industrial Court. So go down to what's now Hyde Park Barracks and sit in and see what happens." And I'd never been in a courtroom before, and went in and sat. And I said, "What do I do?" And he said, "Oh, when the judge comes in, you stand up and bow if you have to go out or come in late or whatever. So I went and sat in the court, and 5 associates came out and stood in a row along in front of the chairs at the front. 5 tip staffs came out and stood behind the chairs, and 5 judges in robes came out, and the tip staffs pulled the chairs out for them to sit down. And I've never seen any sort of show like that. It was theatre. I can't remember what the case was about, but it was magic.
And what did you come to like about industrial relations?
Well, it was about the people and finding outcomes that even if both parties weren't 100% satisfied, finding outcomes they could live with, and trying to take a longer term view. I mean, you see a lot of things about negotiation, and they're in commercial sense, and they're one-offs. You know, when they've finished the case and someone's won or someone's lost or they've split it up, they go away and they might never see each other again. But an employer has to, you know, the people working in the industry, in the company, and the employer have to live together for ongoing years. So it's a different sort of negotiation. It involves, finding something that there's going to be an ongoing setup from, and that means you trying to understand the other people and where they're coming from. And I just enjoyed all that.
And you didn't miss chemistry?
No, I was over chemistry by that stage. My wife's degree is in psychology, and I used to bounce things off her because she was quite a strong influence on me developing my thinking.
And what happened with your career after that?
Well, I was in the right. I think I did fairly well at it, and I went through various places in CSR. Firstly, the sugar refineries, CSR chemicals, building materials, oil and gas, and various other bits and pieces, and got involved in occupational health and safety a bit, but sort of gradually more senior positions as I went along. And I was at the end of the time at CSR, I was Deputy Chief Industrial Manager, but most of my job, half of it at least, was with their oil and gas division, and in a rationalisation they sold the oil and gas division. So my boss said to me, "Oh, well, look, we'll find you something else to do," but frankly that didn't sound very exciting. So and coincidentally at that time I was headhunted to go to Westpac as Chief Industrial Manager. So that was a change of industry, and that was good. I was able to help achieve some good things there about women and about non-smoking and about improving the superannuation, and the sort of thing was that the superannuation fund, because it was a in-house fund, said you could if someone died, the payout would go to his widow, or brackets then sort of they'd added on, or de facto wife. So I said, why does it have to be specific? What about gay relationships? And that was a first blink. Sort of battered a few eyelids, but it was just something that it was the time to do it and time to make it happen, and we did. And then I was there for a while, and I got asked if I was interested in going to the Business Council of Australia as an assistant director, and that was a change again, because although it was a lot of policy development and research and advocacy, something I enjoyed for my 3 or 4 years there. And I finished there. I knew a lot of people, so I started doing my own business, consulting on change management and employee relations. But one day an old friend from Colin Polites, who was by that stage a deputy president of the Federal Commission, and who was a great singer and opera buff, and knew I was interested in opera. So he rang me up one day and said, "Did you know Opera Australia was looking for a human resources director with some strengths in IR?" And he said, "I wondered if you want to put your name in the hat." And I said, "Oh, give me 30 seconds to think about it." And so that was the beginning of another change. And I spent the next, until I retired, at Opera Australia, which was exciting because there'd been no one in that role before. So there were a lot of things that needed to be done and simplified and thought about.
And what made Opera Australia a different sort of place to work?
Well, partly because it had such a huge range of people. I mean, the difference in the sort of way they're all employed in a sense, but between a principal singer or a chorister or an orchestral musician or a stagehand or someone working in the costume department or the scenery department or selling tickets or whatever, there was a huge range. And their conditions and the work patterns they had were quite different. So trying to make sure you had some fairness in the whole thing was quite a challenge, but a great fun. And you could say that principal singers, prima donnas, are high maintenance and difficult to manage. But in the oil and gas division of CSR, I had geophysicists, and they were pretty much the same high maintenance crowd. So it was good learning.
And what do you know about the history of the society? When did you first join the society?
Well, when I went to CSR's industrial department in, as I said, 1969, Brian Brennan, who was the chief industrial manager, said to all of his people, "Now you really should join the Industrial Relations Society and meet a few other people." So we all did, dutifully, and it was great because it was a chance to meet other people, not just hearing the same thing in an employer association, but talk to unions and commissioners and lawyers and whatever, and it was great camaraderie, and we learnt a lot. I learnt a lot. It was a pretty blokey sort of setup in 69, 70. Took quite a few years before Industrial Relations Society of New South Wales had any women on the committee, I think, and you probably have heard that from Robin a bit earlier. There were some women delegates to conferences, but not very many, and it was essentially a blokey environment. But the driving force, I think, as far as I can work out, as I said, I came along 10 years after it started, had been very much the strong employers and the strong unionists who wanted there to be some neutral territory, I suppose, you'd say, where you could talk to someone else and get to know someone a bit, get to know where they were coming from. And Kingsley Laffer, who was the first secretary and was an important driver, was an academic, but most of the other people were not. And most of the people who were the big players in it were not. And there were quite senior people. I mean, there was Bob Harvey was an assistant general manager of CSR, and Robert Webster was the chief of Brad Mill Industries, and similarly you had the president of the Trades and Labour Council. They were people who were at the peaks of their organisations.
And what leadership roles did you hold with the society?
Well, the society in those days, the treasurer of the society was probably the biggest physically job, because the New South Wales Society managed the Journal of Industrial Relations, but the treasurer had to manage all the external subscriptions. Not the members of the society got the journal, and that came in from each society's secretary, but the subscriptions by universities and libraries and people who wanted to get the journal. The treasurer managed that and had to chase up late players and get in and package up and post back issues when they wanted for. So it was quite a time-consuming job. It wasn't terribly difficult, but it was time-consuming. And CSR had which was always very supportive of the society, let someone who was a treasurer have a fair bit of company time to do things in. So Brian Brennan, Ian Burgess, Jim Lear, myself, Hugh McConnell, all filled that role because we were given the leave to do it. So I started off as treasurer, and then having done that for a few years and left CSR, handed it over to Hugh McConnell. I stayed on the committee as a committee member for another few years, and then I was president in 92, 93, before I went to Melbourne. And the other thing I guess I was involved with by the stage of the 80s, the Industrial Relations Society was getting much more involved in the IIRA, the International Industrial Relations Association, as it then was. It's changed its name now, as you'll no doubt tell us later on. And John Nyland, who you saw earlier, was president of the International Association. And the scheme of things they had was that people were elected, someone was elected president for 3 years, and they had a World Congress at the end of the 3 years in the home country of the president. So John Nyland became president in 89 at a congress in Brussels because he was succeeding a Belgian professor. And so we had to organise the next conference in 92 in Sydney, and that was quite a challenging but eventually very successful role. And I was secretary of the organising committee. A chap called Derek Graham, who died some years ago, was the person who did a lot of the hard work to make it all happen. So we were pretty pleased about that.
What do you think the strengths of the society are, and what do you think its future is?
Well, industrial relations has changed fairly dramatically since the 1960s, and it's not often the headlines and the newspapers as it used to be then, when a strike or a threatened strike or a lockout or a dispute was often in the papers. And the various changes to the legislation that have been introduced mean that the industrial relations per se in a formal sense are not as critical in the relations between employer and employee as they used to be. So I don't think industrial relations is the same sort of high profile profession it once was. And so perhaps you could argue there's not as much need for an industrial relations study, but on the other hand, you still have to get to know the other people and be able to talk to them and negotiate with them. And as I said earlier, negotiate with an expectation the relationship's going to go on and not just be one-off. And that means it's important to have some understanding of where the other people are coming from and what they're likely to be, their objectives are likely to be, because the real objectives are not always what people say they are on either side of the room. So I think it's perhaps less important than it was, but it still has a role, and that the sort of camaraderie and the conversations, which are the two things, I think are still important. It's a much more academic society than it was back then, but that partly gives a vehicle for discussions of issues and things, a better basis for it, not just bush lawyers talking to each other. So I think it does still have a role, though it's probably a different role than it was in the 60s and 70s and even the 80s.
And just finally, because we're reaching the end of our time, what do you think makes industrial relations a good career for a young person?
Well, someone a century or so ago said, for a young man with a good general education and a slightly histrionic temperament, there were three professions. You could go to the bar and be a barrister, you could go to the church and be a clergyman, or you could be an actor. And my take on it was, back in the 1970s, there's a fourth option, and that was to work in industrial relations, either for an employer or for a union. I think they were similar things. I think there's no longer quite the glamour and the importance of industrial relations in terms of the employer-employee relationship. The formal stuff is not quite as important. So it's. I don't know the answer to your question to be clear about it, but I think there's still a need for the ability to communicate.
That's great. Is there anything that you want to talk about that we haven't touched on yet?
I think you've been pretty good at raising all the things. No, there are lots of anecdotes, and everyone, of people I've known in industrial relations, whenever we meet and have lunch or a drink or a cup of coffee or whatever, we're always saying, "Oh, do you remember when so and so did such and such?" And that's the memory of those funny things that happened, or a side comment that someone made, or part of the magic of reminiscing. And I just hope that people currently in industrial relations will have that when they look back.
Great. Thank you so much.